10 at night, you open the banking app, no particular reason, just the habit before bed. You scroll to the savings account, the one you've been steadily feeding every month for 3 years now. The number appears, $14,320. You scroll down to see the interest earned over the past year, $61. You stare at that number for a while, trying to understand how a sum that large, kept so carefully for 3 years, could produce exactly the cost of dinner for 2. You don't turn off the screen right away. You sit there, looking at the $14,320, and think, this is my money. It's all still here. None of it is gone. But there's a very faint feeling, almost too small to notice, like you've just realized a door you thought was locked to protect something was actually only locking it in place, while the world outside that door kept moving. You lock the phone, set it on the pillow. Nothing dramatic happened that night. No money lost, no overdue bill. Just a very small number, $61, sitting next to a very large one, $14,320. And the gap between the two, if you look at it long enough, starts telling a story no one has ever told you quite this way before. A month before that night, you were having lunch with a coworker who mentioned he'd opened an investment account in an index fund, putting in a fixed amount every month, not much, around $100. You asked if he wasn't afraid of losing it. He laughed, said sure. At first he was terrified. Watching the balance jump up and down every day felt unbearable. But then he said, after a while, he stopped opening the app every day, only checked occasionally, and each time he did, that number, even with its ups and downs, kept growing over time, nothing like the standing still feeling you were used to. A few weeks later, you were at the grocery store and startled to see the total for your usual cart, the same things you buy every week, was noticeably higher than last year. You hadn't bought more. Prices had risen, quietly, bit by bit, so gradually you didn't notice until you saw the total on the receipt. You stood in the parking lot, loading bags into the trunk, and thought about the $14,320 sitting quietly in savings. It hadn't shrunk, that was true. But what it could buy, compared to a year ago, was a little less. It stood still on the screen while quietly shrinking in real life. One weekend evening, you visited your grandfather. He told you not to complain, just reminiscing, that the money he'd saved from his wages as a young man, kept in a savings account for many years, would have been enough back then to buy a small house. Now, that same amount, plus all the interest it had accumulated, was only enough for a used car. He didn't say it bitterly, he was just stating a fact, the way you'd mention old weather. But you sat quietly, watching your tea go cold on the table, and for the first time understood that the feeling of safety in a savings account never dropping could actually still be a form of loss, just the kind of loss that never shows up as a minus sign. A few days later at work, the company announced the annual raise, a modest number, enough to offset some of the rising cost of living. You plan to let the extra amount flow straight into savings like every year, out of habit. But this time, sitting down to run the numbers, you realized that raise, after subtracting how much prices had climbed that year, barely changed your actual standard of living at all. You were still running, just running to stay in place, and the savings account, even growing a little each month, was running in exactly the same way. Another afternoon, you came across a short article online saying that average inflation over recent decades in the US has typically hovered around 3% a year, with some years far higher. You did the math in your head. If your savings account interest rate was only about 0.5%, while prices rose on average about 6 times that rate every year, that quiet gap, compounded over years, was far larger than anything you'd imagined by just looking at the absolute number on your banking screen. That weekend, you were cleaning out a drawer and found an old passbook from when you'd first started working, the kind of paper booklet few banks even use anymore. The first page listed the date the account was opened, a long time ago, along with an opening balance of just a few $100s. You flipped through a few pages, watching the numbers climb with each deposit. Slow, steady, patient, exactly the way you'd always been taught was right. But when you tried recalculating what that same money, over that same number of years, would look like if it had gone somewhere else instead of that book. The gap between the two outcomes was large enough that you had to close the book, set it aside, and sit still for a moment before going back to the drawer. On the way home, you texted a close friend, asked what she thought about investing. She sent back a screenshot. Her investment account, started 5 years ago with a few $100s a month, now worth far more than the total she'd ever put in, the difference coming from that money being left alone to grow over time, not from her constantly adding more. She added, almost as if reading your mind, "At first I thought I didn't have enough spare money to invest either. Turns out that wasn't it. I was just letting my money go to the wrong place." That line stayed with you longer than the rest of the evening. A few weeks later, you had a meeting with a mortgage advisor, just to look into things early, not ready to decide anything yet. The advisor asked how much you'd saved for a down payment, and you proudly said the number, nearly $15,000, built up over many years. She typed a few figures into her computer, then said that at current home prices in the area you wanted to buy, the required down payment was much higher than it had been a few years ago, and at your current savings pace, it could take a significant amount of additional time to get there, not to mention home prices would likely keep rising while you saved. You sat still for a moment, trying to keep your expression neutral. A thought crossed your mind. If only you'd had more money to invest earlier. But right after, you remembered what your friend had said. Money doesn't go to the wrong place, because there isn't enough of it. It goes to the wrong place because no one ever showed you there was somewhere else for it to go. That $15,000 was not a small amount. The problem was never that you didn't have enough to start. The problem was that for all those years, the entire sum had only ever been kept still, instead of being allowed to grow. The advisor, maybe noticing the look on your face, added gently that this was a very common situation, that most of her clients arrived with the same thought in their heads, that they could have saved more, faster, if they'd known sooner. She wasn't saying it to reassure you, just sharing a professional observation, but it made you realize that the feeling you thought was entirely your own, the feeling of being a step behind somehow, was actually something a lot of people carried quietly, without ever telling each other. You left the advisor's office, walked to the parking lot, stood there for a moment before opening the car door. The feeling wasn't panic, it was more like a very quiet recalculation, the kind you get when you realize you miscalculated a number right at the start of a problem, and now have to look back at everything you'd assumed was certain. What's lost here isn't just a few extra years of waiting for a house. It's the certainty you used to have, that saving steadily meant you were headed in the right direction. Money, sitting still in a savings account, is just a stable number on a screen. But that stability, looked at long enough, turns out not to be standing still relative to the world around it at all. It only stands still relative to itself, while everything else, home prices, food prices, the cost of living, keeps moving. One thing needs to be said clearly. Sitting in the car that day, you also realized no number is guaranteed. Investment markets can rise, and they can fall over short stretches of time. No one promises a specific return. And what you heard from your coworker or your close friend was only their own story, not accounting for taxes, transaction fees, or downturns they might not have mentioned in full. But even discounting for all of that uncertainty, one truth still holds. A savings account earning very little interest will almost certainly fail to keep pace with the rising cost of living, while an account that stands completely still is guaranteed to fall behind. That night, back home, you opened the banking app again, not to do anything in particular, just to look at the $14,320 one more time. This time you didn't see it as an achievement, you saw it as an unanswered question. You didn't transfer any money anywhere that night, you just opened the investment app your coworker had mentioned, created an account, then stopped at the screen asking how much you wanted to deposit for the first time. You didn't hit confirm. You just sat there looking at the empty field for a while, then turned off the phone and went to sleep. Part of you wanted to type in a large number right away, to make up for the years of delay, but you stopped, remembering what your grandfather had said about the house from years ago, not because he'd made one wrong decision, but because he'd never once tried a different way in all those years. You didn't need to fix everything in a single night. You just needed to not let that empty screen close again with nothing changed, the way it always had before. Nothing changed that night. Your savings account still held exactly $14,320 the next morning, as stable as ever. But something very small was different. Hard to name but real. You no longer looked at that number as a destination. You looked at it as a starting point, where, for the first time in many years, you asked yourself whether you were keeping it there because it was truly the safest place, or simply because it was the only place you'd ever known to keep money. This story isn't really about interest rates or index funds. It's about the difference between the feeling of safety and actual safety, and about how a number standing still on a screen can be quietly moving backward relative to the world around it, even when no one ever tells you so. The coworker at lunch isn't wealthier than you because he got lucky. The close friend with the screenshot isn't smarter than you about money. Both of them simply stopped seeing an unchanging balance as a finish line at some point earlier than you did, a point neither of them can quite pin down anymore either. So if your account hasn't dropped by a single dollar in years, do you think that's proof you've been doing it right, or just proof you've never once looked at it next to the things that are actually moving?